Excuse me, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us here. My name is Matt Wedeking. I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Parks. Appreciate all those in the room and all those people online. Thanks for joining us. There is a handout. If you don't have one, we can pass one back to you. Before I get started, I'd like to let everybody know John Boyle, the Commissioner of DNR, is here. So is Deputy Commissioner Brent Goodrum.
Where's John?
Right here.
Oh, thank you for your hospitality.
I know people online will be able to see this, but if there are any ex-park employees in the room, could you please stand up just for a moment? Come on. Thank you all for coming. I know there's a lot of present park people as well. But without further ado, I don't need to be up here talking, so I'm going to say it's a privilege to welcome Neil Johannsen, a foundational figure in Alaska State Park history. Neil began his career with DNR in 1971 as the first superintendent of Chugach State Park, and went on to serve as director of Alaska State Parks for just about 13 years, the longest tenure in our agency's history. Under his leadership, 46 park units were established, including the Kenai River Special Management Area and 33 state marine parks. Impressive. He coined the phrase "system of dreams" to describe Alaska's parks, places born from the vision and dedication of countless Alaskans. Today, as part of America 250 Alaska Celebration Series, Neil will share stories from his years in parks, reflecting on the people, places, and pivotal moments that shape our state's public lands. Please join me in welcoming Neil Johannsen.
Well, now that I'm here, I better get organized. Thank you all for being here. And I want to thank Commissioner John Boyle for his hospitality this morning, in which I lobbied the hell out of him on the importance of state parks.
That's right.
And I'm so pleased. Yeah. 54 years ago last week, I walked into DNR responding to an ad in the Anchorage Times that said, Superintendent of Parks, that was the title, for $1,200 a month. And it was an enormous honor to be there so long. I was first superintendent at Chugach State Park, as mentioned, but what they didn't say in the ad is that you would also be in charge of the Kenai Peninsula, of which there were a lot of parks then that are there today, and Kodiak. And I also discovered that I had a budget of about $20,000 to run all those parks. And so that was a challenge. Over the years, I worked for 5 governors and 11 commissioners. And I actually enjoyed working for all of them. The first commissioner I worked for was Phil Holdsworth, and he was Governor Egan, and so my first governor was Governor Egan. So in the beginning, Chugach State Park was sort of a do anything, go anywhere, do anything you want to do. The whole hillside was a mud bath because people with their off-road vehicles and Jeeps and motorcycles, shooters, it really was. Doug Fessler here, who's one of the great people I've ever known, even though we didn't always get along too well, he's maybe the most courageous person I know. And Pete Panarese, I want to mention Pete. Pete and I hiked up Eagle River Valley on Saturday, and at one point he said, do you want to live dangerously? Didn't go into the closed areas, but we both walked off the trail a little bit and encountered 3 grizzly bear cubs and then the mama. And I looked at Pete and I said, "Truff, truff, that sounds like a bear." And so I said, I guess I might not be here Wednesday. But Pete enabled us to disappear. And so that was a wonderful experience. I had just driven up in my Volkswagen Beetle from my parents' ranch just north of San Francisco up the Alaska Highway to become a Forest Service naturalist at Portage Glacier. And I lived in a 12-foot trailer. It was $20 a month. And that was when I read the ad from DNR. At the end of the summer, I got laid off. And so I was able to get the job. I'm not sure there were any other people who really applied for it. And but Doug Fessler and I both had silver badges and ticket books and uniforms. But most of the park rangers in '71 drove garbage trucks. We had if you were a park ranger, you had a uniform and you had a badge and you wore coveralls. And part of it was the CETA program, as I'm sure Doug remembers. We basically had no staff. And Doug came up with all these interesting ideas all the time, like we had to put 5 sticks of firewood at every campsite every day, and Doug started spraying the firewood with a little streak of orange because people would steal the firewood. But part of the job of a park ranger was to maintain all the highway pull-offs that had trash cans. And, you know, the first park ranger, in my opinion, is Mike Lee. Raise your hand. Mike probably doesn't remember this, but he went to work April 13th of 1970, and he was up in the Mat-Su Valley. And I didn't have any fear of flying until I flew with him. He gave me a fear of flying. And one of the first things that Pete Panarese said to me is, watch and pay attention to other people's mistakes because you don't have time to make all your own mistakes. I proved you wrong. I made all the mistakes. The first budget for Chugach State Park was a capital budget item that allowed us to survey much of the western boundary of the park because there was so much irritation by a lot of people at the creation of that park. And so we surveyed the boundary in places, and the other capital money was to develop a master plan for the park, and which I never thought was worth a darn. As the new superintendent, the first time I drove up the Eagle River Valley, a person walked out on the road. I was in a state DNR car and waved me down and said if he ever saw me up the valley again, he was going to shoot me. The park was not welcomed by everybody. So that was one of my first experiences. Back then, the nature center at the end of the Eagle River Valley was called the Paradise Haven Lodge. And it was where everybody drank themselves to the point where they would often go off the road into these little marshes along the Eagle River. And now it's a nature center. One of my jobs was to plow the ice off of Mirror Lake for ice skaters because Mirror Lake was part of the park. It really wasn't, but anyway, and we also had the Peters Creek Campground and some places that are not part of the park, but there was almost no law enforcement training. I had a badge and a ticket book, and I patrolled the park with a snow machine. I had no training, I had no safety equipment, I had nothing. I would take off in a snow machine and I would race down to Klutna Lake and places like that where I was patrolling, but it was very difficult. The job essentially was impossible. It really was not possible. And you know, my roots were with California state parks. I was raised on a ranch in Northern California. My first state park job was driving a garbage truck for California state parks. And so that's how I started my career. But we saw, all of us, a clear possibility of creating an amazing park system here. As Commissioner John said this morning, we have a world-class park system. And John is supportive of that. I'm happy with your, I mean, he's a mixed guy, but you know, he, State park history. In 1957, the Congress passed Public Law 85-407 that funded the BLM to create 32 what they called waysides. So the roots of the park system was mostly because there was a lot of wildfire, and people would park in gravel pits and pull off the road and build a fire. And so in 1957, that law allowed the construction of 32 what were called waysides. And that was really, in some ways, the roots. And of course, in 1959, the Congress passed what was called the Alaska Omnibus Act. And I need to move quicker here. But the Alaska Omnibus Act in 1959 transferred those 32 highway waysides to the state of Alaska. But the other thing the Omnibus Act did in 1959 is it gave the management of fish and wildlife, fish and game up here they call it, to the state. And so at the same law that gave DNR these waysides gave fish and game management. So it was an important bill. And the Statehood Act in '59 allowed the state to select about 145 million acres and also 400,000 acres out of the national forests. And the 400,000 acres out of the national forests were for two purposes: recreation and community development, community expansion. And that led to a whole bunch of interesting things. But in 1966, as I'm sure the commissioner knows, Stuart Udall put a land freeze on the transfer of lands to the state until the Native Claims Act was enabled. And so we called it a land freeze. But that was eventually lifted. In December of '71, the Native Claims Land Act passed, December. I remember it was on my mother's birthday when that changed. I got to remind everybody I'm 80, so I have to sort of look at this stuff because I don't necessarily remember it all. But a few years after I joined DNR, I'm going to talk about some specific parks. Funding became available in DNR to study the Wood River Tikchik Lakes area. And so for 2 years, 2.5 years, I worked on nothing but the Wood Tikchik area and to make it into a state park. And Wood Tikchik State Park was created, I think, because it was a proposed national park unit. And a lot of people still say, well, it was going to be a national park. Actually, the National Park Service wanted to make it into a national recreation area. And so the state filed a land claim over the Wood Tikchik area in 1961. But the BLM would not transfer it to the state because it was a proposed national park unit. But in 1963, it was transferred. And the Denali State Park, same thing. It was a proposed expansion to the south of Denali National Park. Excuse me, I don't use the word McKinley. And those two areas, Wood Tikchik and Denali State Park, are 2 million acres of the 3 million acres. And so it was the proposal to make these national parks that Bill Egan and DNR Commissioner Phil Holdsworth selected it in '61. But that BLM wouldn't transfer it, but at least initially. And so, I mean, here we are. This is stuff all seems like kind of ancient history. We're talking about stuff that 65 years ago. And so I started holding hearings on the Wood-Tikchik State Park in Elegnagic and Dillingham and New Stuyahawk and places out there. And that was very interesting for me back in those years. I worked entirely alone on Wood-Tikchik for 2.5 years. And the first hearing I held in Elegnagic, I had a translator who was the local school teacher trying to explain the idea of a protected national park would help protect the Bristol Bay fisheries, et cetera, there. And after I'd made this presentation, I said, are there questions? And there was an older woman, native woman, who raised her hand and asked me, they didn't see government people. She asked me, why is my Social Security check late? They didn't see anybody from the government, so that was the question. One of the things that, I mean, I explored the area extensively. I worked a lot with Department of Fish and Game, Division of Lands, went through lots of stuff. I remember DNR Commissioner Chuck Herbert singled me out one day and came in my office and asked me what I was doing. You're going to create a 1.5 million acre state park. And you know, he wasn't all that thrilled, but I explained it to this early commissioner, and he said, I like that, I support that. And then there was a director of lands who was also the deputy commissioner of DNR for parks. His name was Michael C.T. Smith. How many of people here have heard of Michael C.T. Smith? I was called into his office to explain myself that I was trying to create this massive park. And when I walked into his office, he was on a phone call, and he was obviously very angry. I told the commissioner the story this morning. And so I thought, he's angry at me because I'm trying to create this park. And he took off his right shoe and beat his telephone into pieces on top of his desk. There were pieces of his telephone flying through the air in there. And I figured, oh boy, this is not going well. And then he wheeled around and he said, why are you here? And I said, I'm here because I want to make Wood-Tikchik a state park. Oh, I think that's a good idea. Get out. One of the things that existed, and I'm not sure that I did a good job of explaining this to Commissioner Boyle, is back then DNR was small, and if you were in the kind of job I was in, you were free. You could go after it. And basically I had support. I was working for Bill Egan and the commissioner and stuff like that. They did not control you and say, what are you doing? I don't want you to do that. You can't go to Juneau. Now things are more tightly managed in DNR. But I was a free bird. I went to Juneau. When I was director, I went to Juneau once a week and lobbied for parks and lobbied for budgets, lobbied to create the fee system, which Pete helped with. And I published a lot. I just published, I was a writer, and I did 30 of these kind of brochures. Mike Lee remembers just these old brochures. I published. And when I was working on Wood-Tikchik State Park before the commissioner had approved it, I published a magazine article. I was publishing magazine articles. Alaska Magazine ran a feature article about the proposed Wood-Tikchik State Park. And so there was a freedom that doesn't exist. I was after it. And this is an interesting brochure. This brochure, very, very briefly, and nobody here I bet even remembers this, they combine forestry and parks. This says Chugach District Division of Forestry, Forests and Parks. It was very brief. A guy named Bill Sachek, who had been the state forester, became the state park director briefly until he retired. But somehow they were combined, and so here's a brochure, Division of Parks and Forests, and this was published in 1974. I don't get any ideas about that. It was hard to get parks in those years, 75, because of All of you know what D2, the Alaska National Interest Lands Act, whatever. But I published constantly stuff to create parks. This 14-page booklet in 1978, somehow I had written this, somehow Jay Hammond got this booklet. And of course he was a Bristol Bay guy. He was a Lake Clark guy, but he spent lots of time in this area. And when Jay Hammond got his hands on this, I had an audience with him. He introduced the bill in 1978 that created 1.6 million acre state park. Jay Hammond, a Republican. And when Jay Hammond signed the park into law, it was in a sleazy bar on the side of the McKay building. I think it was June 29th of 1978. And I was so proud because there were 4 or 5 people there. Jay Hammond walked up to me and gave me the pen, only pen, and said, "Thank you for doing this. I love this place, thank you." And so I promptly lost the pen that signed the biggest state park in America into law. But constantly I was publishing in national magazines, whatever. And no DNR commissioner tried to stop me. And so this led to the biggest state park in America. Publish. I was doing all kinds of things to create the park system. I was a writer. One of the places where I published there used to be a magazine called Alaska Geographic. Maybe it still exists, but I published an article in Alaska Geographic about the proposed Wood-Tikchik State Park. And people let me do what I was doing. I'm sure that would not happen with Commissioner Boyle. But it created the largest state park in America, just that freedom. And one of the little side comments that popped into my head is when Steve Cooper was elected governor, he succeeded Bill Sheffield. The first piece of legislation that he proposed was to rename the Wood-Tikchik State Park the Jay Hammond State Park. And I hadn't been reappointed. And I went to Steve, the High Plains Drifter, he was called as governor, and I said, I oppose that. I think that these parks, as much as possible, should be named for the geographic features that they have. Chugach State Park, not Tom Fink State Park. And so I opposed that, and I figured that I was done. But he reappointed me. Yeah, I'm going to talk about another state historic park, which is Judy Bittner here? Oh, all these people I work with have gotten gray. I used to ski all the time up at Hatcher Pass, and I was always impressed with this old mine structures. And I realized I was sensitive to the fact that mining was a major big deal in the economy, the early economy of the state. And so I was up there quite a bit, and I got to know a guy named Hap Wurlitzer. He had a little cross-country ski lodge. And he called me in the winter of 1978 and said, the Hatcher Pass Independence Mine property just came on the market for sale. And it was 638 acres of the surface and subsurface, 638 acres. And a Manhattan businessman wanted $200,000 for it. And he was just simply proud to say he owned a gold mine in Alaska. I wish I had a price of gold. I wish I had a gold mine in Alaska. And so 638 acres, 200 grand. I went to Jay Hammond's office because I was a free bird. I just did this stuff. And I got $7,500 from Jay Hammond's contingency fund, and I bought the option for a year to all that property, $7,500. And then I went to the legislature for the $200,000 to purchase it. And the legislature weren't going to buy some old mine, and so I couldn't get the money. And so in the summer of '78, a guy named Starkey Wilson, who's a Texas miner and somebody who I came to really liked working with him, he wanted it, and I said, well, what are we going to get? We want all these historic buildings to be a state historic park. And so Jeff Lowenfels, how many people know of him? Jeff Lowenfels was the Assistant Attorney General for DNR, and Starkey Wilson, there was another person, John something. We locked ourselves in a suite in the top of the Captain Cook Hotel for a whole weekend with maps, and we negotiated. Starkey would get the option if he donated to the state the 178 acres to create the Independence Mine State Historic Park. And it recently got a grant and stuff like that. So we were able to, I remember I made some major screw up at that point. I was always publishing this stuff, and I published a booklet that said the proposed Independence Mine State Historic Park, the Mother Lode of Alaska, and the misspelling LOAD, the Mother Lode. I had to reprint it. I was so embarrassed, but I got it reprinted, and we spread it all over the place. But it was then the 1979 legislature wouldn't appropriate the money, but we were able to, in that weekend in the Captain Cook Hotel, get the park. So thank you, Jeff Lowenfels. He deserves some serious responsibility for that. I think it's a great place still. And then in 1979, I was appointed the deputy director of California State Parks. I went from having 5 employees in the planning section to having 2,500 employees the next day. And then Governor Brown made me the chief of operations. I ended up running the California State Park system for some years. But then I also remember that on January 7th, I think it was 1991, I was on the Capitol steps in California, Sacramento. I listened to Pete Wilson give his inaugural speech, and I was kind of young and dumb still. And I went back to my office and got a phone call. I was fired. In fact, the chief of staff for the new governor of California targeted me, and I was told to be out of my office by 5 o'clock. But I was angry. I rode my bicycle home in Sacramento, and I figured I'll clean out my office tomorrow. What are they going to do, fire me? And so I was in my office the next day, and I got a phone call from Esther Wanneke, who was with Bill Sheffield, and Esther said, we want you to come home and run the park system. And so from 2,500 employees to like 50 employees or whatever, that was the change. And so I came home. But state government back then, DNR back then, allowed me a level of freedom that would never be possible today. And all this stuff, I realize I'm going back in time. I was state park director for 12 years and 9 months. And we created 48 new state parks. One of the things that I was really keen on, and I've heard Al Miners is on the phone. Al Miners, Jack Horner, who was the ranger in Haines, and Dr. Hilton Wolf came to me with an idea to create a marine park system. And I was a sailboat guy. In the mid-1970s, I built a 30-foot sailboat, 6-ton sloop offshore sailboat, right across from the Alaska Zoo. I wanted a big sailboat that I could take offshore. I didn't have any money. And so I built a 30-foot sailboat. And I remember as I was building the interior, I would often hear the wolves across the street howling. And so I was in there sanding teak and stuff like that, and listen to, ooh. That sailboat became the sort of the base of operations. Al Miners and I sailed a lot on that, in which we really drew up much of the state of the marine park system. You know, it was in the Statehood Act, as I mentioned, that the state could get 400,000 acres. And so Dr. Hilton Wolf and Chuck Horner and Al Miners and I drew up a master plan for the marine park system. And when I came back from California, Senator Vic Fisher had introduced a bill in the 1983 legislature to create 12 of those marine parks. And Vic and I became blood brothers. And I dedicated my life, as if I wouldn't live another day, to creating those marine parks. And the way I was able to do that is I went to every newspaper and every city council in Southeast Alaska and around Prince William Sound and lobbied. I wanted to get the cities and the newspapers to do editorial support, to pass resolutions supporting the marine park system. And I ended up taking it further. I'd always had troubles with Bob Atwood. You know, he opposed the national parks. He opposed the bike trail system here. He opposed the creation of a bus system. Very, very, very conservative guy. And I went to him and we became buddies. And I went to Wally Hickel, met with him in his office several times, and ended up ghostwriting for them editorial support for the marine park system. And I went to the conservative side. Everybody in this world has a torpedo. And part of your job with public service work is to keep somebody from firing that torpedo, to get them sort of on your side. And so one of the approaches I took was to go after the most conservative opinion makers, to not fire their torpedo, but to support this. And it worked. Bill Sheffield signed into law the first 12 marine parks, and Bill gave me the pen. I had so many pens. Anyway, all these crazy, see, I ran the commissioner off. I've run off a lot of commissioners. Again, I worked for 11 DNR commissioners. In fact, I think it was Pete who once told me that commissioners are a dime a dozen. Maybe it wasn't Pete. It could have been Mike Lee. So anyway, and just to quickly on the marine park system, in 1983 we established 12 marine parks, 86, 7 marine parks, 1990, 14 marine parks. But the master plan that Hilton and Al and I had drawn up called for 90 marine parks. Only a third of them have been established. I lobbied John for an hour this morning about why can't we create more of those marine parks? And I realized that some of it was, you know, Al was a kayaker, Hilton Wolf had a boat, I had built this 30-foot sailboat, that we were saltwater people and we thought it was great. You know, I mean, part of the Statehood Act said recreation. In 1983, I renamed the Division of Parks to the Division of Parks and Outdoor Recreation. I wanted to add a friendlier word during D2 days because parks were bad. We opposed parks, lockups. And so I changed the name of the division in 1983. I actually stole the name from Colorado State Parks. They were Division of Parks and Outdoor Recreation, so I stole that. Also created in 83, and Mike Lee was part of this, there's a little logo that we used to, Mike and I called it the Eagle logo. And so I told, when I was in California State Parks, I wanted to create a marketing logo. I just wanted people to be supportive of parks. And so Mike Lee and a guy named Clark James Mishler, who was a friend of mine, we designed the logo, which is still everywhere. I see it everywhere. I got it on everywhere. the first time that Mike Lee brought in the idea to show me an image, I said, Mike, what's wrong with this picture? The eagle had a black tail, not a white tail. I said, Mike, what's wrong with this? We established, due to budget cuts, what became the largest volunteer system in the state in 1983. We call it VIP, Volunteers in Parks. And Pete was helpful with that. We built a Veterans Memorial in Denali State Park. Why is the Veterans Memorial in Denali State Park? Because it's halfway between Fairbanks and Anchorage. And it happened to be in Denali State Park. Anyway, we built a Veterans Memorial. Public use cabins. The commissioner was telling me this morning that there's 90. They're very, very popular. In 1983, the superintendent of parks in the valley came to me because what state parks had been doing in the Nancy Lake State Recreation Area, we had bought some of the cabins and little private parcels in the park. And what state parks was doing, it was leasing them out for a year. The high bidder would get this cabin for a year. Mike was involved with this. And I said, I don't want to do that. I don't think it's fair. I said, I think we should mimic what the U.S. Forest Service has done and start public use cabins where you can rent it, so I could canoe in and use it, not somebody has the cabin in Nancy Lake for a whole year. And so that was the genesis of the public use cabin program. And then we lobbied through and created Chugach Island State Park, which is a magnificent place. It is a magic place. When I got that bill through the legislature, Senator Fred Zaroff in Kodiak said, you guys are creating some cabin program. And he said, well, I'm going to put a fiscal note in here to build 2 public use cabins. I said, okay. And that was the first 2 public use cabins that were created and supported by the legislature. So that was the birth of the public use cabin program, was in '83, when I simply said, I don't want these things to go to somebody for a year. Some years back, I coined a term called a system of dreams. And I would like to talk about that for a minute. Every state park, in my view, is the idea of a person or a group of people. Chugach State Park is a great example. Art Davidson, Sharon Cisna, Pete Martin, others. It was a dream they had, and it became a reality. And it's true for almost all parks. Somebody had an idea to create a Clam Gulch park. All these ideas were part of what I viewed as a system of dreams. And but one thing that a lot of people don't realize, here I'm going to, most of the acreage, most of the large parks were created by Republicans. We have a tendency to think that Democrats, they like parks, they support protection of important lands, whatever, but almost all the big state parks. Nancy Lake State Recreation Area is often viewed as the first legislative unit in the park system. The person who created that was Republican Keith Miller, who was the lieutenant governor to Wally Hickel. First bill was a Republican from the Valley, Keith Miller. And it was signed into law. Chugach State Park was created by Lowell Thomas Jr., Senator, and Representative Helen Byrne, Republican. Lowell Thomas became a close friend. In fact, Lowell Thomas married Hillary Hilscher and I in our own house, Lowell Thomas. So I was pretty close to him. And so Chugach State Park, Republicans. Denali State Park was created by Jack Coghill. I knew him well. He was a real right-wing guy. It was Jack Coghill's bill that created Denali State Park. Kachemak Bay State Park, Kachemak Bay State Wilderness Park was created by Republican Clintillion. When I wrote the legislation for Wood Tikchik, that was introduced by Jay Hammond, Republican. The Kenai River Special Management Area, Don Gilman was a very important person in the creation of that, Republican state senator. So even though I'm a D, I'm a greenie, I'm kind of a moderate guy, I think we should remember that so many of these big parks were created by the GOP. And I just think it's, and there were many others that were created that way. Yeah, the Kenai River Special Management Area, you know, Don Gilman was a key person to do that. All these people are dead, or most all of them are gone. And, you know, all these commissioners I work for, most all of them are gone, Astor Wanakee. So I'm here as an antique to sort of recollect. Someday you'll be an antique, if you're lucky. One of the things that I had put in the Wood Tikchik bill was the ability to add lands on the south area of Wood Tikchik State Park after the Native Claims Settlement Act was resolved. And so in 1985, my planning chief then, Jack Wiles, wrote up a resolution that was signed into law, adding a couple 100,000 acres to Wood Tikchik State Park. And but all this stuff, you know, it's the Chena River State Recreation Area was initially the idea and presented by the Fairbanks Garden Club, mostly a women's group, but they were System of Dreams. I go back to that, System of Dreams. The Fairbanks Garden Club had the idea for a Chena River Recreation Area. And then we were later, in fact, I wrote this bill too, to expand it by a mere 200,000 acres. And that bill passed. I was shocked that that bill passed. And again, it was Republican support that so often created in these parks. The biggest thing, I mean, I want to mention one more thing about the GOP. And again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not one, but after the Exxon Valdez wreck spill, there was a lot of money that was part of the fine, and I had gotten to be reasonably close with Wally Hickel, and there was a 23,000 acre inholding in Kachemak Bay State Park. When you stood on the Homer Spit and looked across the bay, here was 23,000 acres of lowland forest. The Seldovia Native Association sold it to Concord Timber. And the person running Concord Timber happened to be a friend of mine, John Sturgeon, who had been my fellow director. He was director of forestry. And so he was president of Concord Timber, and he bought all that timber, and he was driving me nuts. We couldn't even have a beer together. But Wally Hickel raised the money through the Exxon fines, and we bought the 23,000 acres. I know you're pro-logging, but I don't think anybody would want to stand on the Homer Spit and see clear cuts. But it was Wally Hickel. In fact, out at the end of the spit when we dedicated that action, Wally Hickel had this bald eagle, and it had been rehabbed, this eagle. And I can still see Wally Hickel dedicating that new parkland, pushing the eagle up into the air, and the eagle flew straight across the bay to that area when Wally Hickel released that eagle. So 1970 was a huge year, many of the big parks. In 1986, we added more marine parks. I think 7 marine parks were added in 86. We got budget cuts. I mean, Jerry Lewinsky he started Fire Island Bakery, by the way, this guy. He was State Parks Director And Pete told me that you didn't like being Parks Director. And so he left and moved to San Francisco and went to baking school, the former Parks Director, and started the Fire Island Bakery.
There's more to that story, but
There's always more to all the stories I tell, but it's...
Terry's also my neighbor.
No. So anyway, budget cuts. I felt like I was a successful state park director, but a total failure in getting an operating budget. I failed. It was just so frustrating to me that the legislature would appropriate money to build a big new campground, they would pass legislation to create a new park, and then they'd cut your operating budget. It was just ridiculous. And that was one of the things that I lobbied the commissioner about this morning, as if he had some money-making machine. And Mike Lee, when I was working on getting the fee bill through the legislature, Mike Lee said he was scared because if we were collecting fees, and it took separate bills to get camping fees, stuff was illegal. You couldn't charge. We got a bill through to create the camping fees. There was another bill that got us day use fees. It took different acts to get these things, and Mike said they're going to make us start paying our own bills. You know, that Matt told me that there's basically no general funds in the park budget anyway. I remember Mike Lee, I can quote him, he said, "If we make a buck, the legislature will cut us by a buck." I remember all these things. I remember all these Pete Panarese things that he used to say to me. They're locked into my head for some reason. In 1987, the Eklutna Corporation had selected all the lands along Eagle River. And so we worked like crazy and did what was called the North Anchorage Land Agreement. Jack Wiles and Al Miners and others were involved with creating this North Anchorage Land Agreement, and that restored lands along the Eagle River. We got that back, and Anchorage got a new dump. We did better. In 1987, we created the Willow Creek State Recreation Area up in the valley, and we purchased Crooked Creek down on the Kenai. And if Harold Hines is listening to this, Harold Hines, even though he was considered to be a real right-wing, almost a crazy guy to me, he was very helpful. State parks for the commissioners often was a green vote because, you know, they're trying to do oil leases and sell timber and mining and stuff like that. But state parks gave most of the DNR commissioners a chance to have a piece of them was green. Maybe you're not so green, but you know, it's true though. So Harold Hines helped a lot with that. The System of Dreams, Point Bridget State Park, north of Juneau. Wonderful, beautiful place. And Senator Jim Duncan hauled me down there, took me out there, and he said, "I want Point Bridget to be a state park." And I thought, this thing I coined, a System of Dreams. Jim Duncan and I went out there and we sat in his office and we drew up the legislation and it passed. And so once again, it was a legislator that had the dream. Yeah, these are simply ideas. The biggest thing, the worst thing that happened in my tenure was the Exxon Valdez accident. But it ended up being a paradox of forces, as awful as it was. It was the Exxon Valdez wreck that allowed us to add Nuka Island and other lands on the outer Kenai coast into the park system. The Exxon Valdez wreck, the legislature passed another bill with, I think, 11 marine parks. You know, the land I mentioned that was purchased in Chugach Bay State Park, Afognak Island State Park. That wasn't state land, it was purchased. Afognak Island State Park was purchased, and it was purchased with Exxon money. And you know, there were, anyway, the Exxon, right? The Exxon Valdez hit Bligh Reef in March of '89, and I happened to be spending that day with Lieutenant Governor Steve McAlpine. He and I were in the state park office, and I was working with Steve McAlpine. And the next day we chartered a plane and flew out to the wreck. And I can still remember Lieutenant Governor and I flying around that wreck, and just the smell in the aircraft made us sick. We couldn't stand it. And I left all of the history of state parks and the state archives. I kept every scrap of paper. If I wrote a note to Jerry Lewonsky or to Judy Bittner, it was all copied. Every letter I wrote, all of my appointments, calendars, everything from even California state parks, but from day one as superintendent Chugach, it's all in the University of Alaska archives. I found sent Pete a note yesterday in which he scribbled a note to me. All of it was saved. Here's a piece of Bligh Reef dug out of the Exxon Valdez. Pass it around. See, I can tell the commissioner what to do now. This is a bottle of Exxon crude that I dipped out on day 2. Exxon Valdez crude. This is all in my archives. I was dug out of the hull of the Exxon Valdez. One of the things that we were also able to do, and Judy Bittner helped enormously with these historic parks, is the Ernest Greening. Ernest Greening was the governor of Alaska for 13 years. His voting address was always a cabin that he had built north of Juneau. And just historically, he wrote the book, a classic book, called Alaska, and it was about this trying to create statehood, Ernest Greening. And so I had a chance, Judy helped, to create the Ernest Greening State Historic Park. I bought the cabin where he wrote the book, and it was his voting address. I bought it. The Wickersham House in Juneau. Again, Judy Bittner helped with this. I bought the Wickersham House in Juneau. God, I was crazy. I was going after everything I could. I remember when we had the addition to Chugach Bay State Park. I thought it logically, since it was next to the Wilderness Park, it should be Chugach Bay State Wilderness Park. But a guy named Rick Halford, how many people know Rick Halford? Rick Halford was my buddy. He flew me everywhere in a souped up 180 on floats, looking for marine park sites, etc. Rick was there. But when I got the bill in to add us to the state, outer coast of the state park, he absolutely demanded that it not be the wilderness park. And he said, if it's a wilderness park, you're going to try to control my ability to fly and land and do what I want with my airplane. I said, dude, you've been helping me. And so we had to make it part of Chugach. And then Rick Halford wanted me to help him on his gubernatorial campaign. I said, I'm still a park director. I can't help you do that stuff. Miners was involved with this. An Austrian company had approached us to build a ski area out by Eagle River. And I even had staff here that opposed that, but I tried to work with the Austrians to see a ski development. The western edge of Chugach State Park in the enabling legislation says that the western fringe is for recreation. You know, the interior is wilderness. And but boy, it was I felt like I was attacked a lot about those things, and that's okay. It's water under the bridge, I guess. But I was, in a way, kind of a pro-development park director, even though I cared so deeply about establishing these parks, dedicated myself to it. And so I retired. I was done. Jerry Lewanski became the director or something like that. But right after I retired, I moved my family to Christchurch, New Zealand. I remember telling Hillary that, hey, I'm toast. And I said, we're going to move to New Zealand. That was back when a man could tell a woman what. And she actually liked the idea. But right after I moved my family to Christchurch, New Zealand, I signed a 2-year contract to work in Russia. When I left here, I spent 2 years in and out of Russia helping to establish a national park system in Russia. While my family was enjoying New Zealand, I was in Siberia. I took some park people once in a while with me, but I also ended up working in Europe and South America on park consulting work. I became a business guy. You know, I suspect your commissioner, when he told me he loves what he's doing, but that he can see that at some point he's going to have to do something else. Anyway, that's just a little bit of my reflection of the 13 years that I was able to do this, and I'm proud, except for my failure with the operating budgets. But anyway, the system of dreams concept, everything is we. It's not me, it's we. And if John can advance some of his projects, he can't do them without your help. And so one last thing I want to say is we seem to be living in an age in which public servants are often attacked. They're laid off, cut the budget. And through all my years running California state parks and Alaska state parks, I have a very high opinion of almost everybody that I worked with in their dedication. Hard workers, people who work all weekend for nothing. And so anyway, I just want to say to the people who run the department that productive public servants enable you to do your job. And so we should be thankful for people like that. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, Judy Bittner was State Historic Preservation Officer for 420 years.
I thought, Tom? Did you have one? I don't know if you even need the mic.
I can just speak up.
Well, it needs to go into the.
Speaking as one of the ancients, I think I can say I was at the beginning of Chugach State Park, because Joe Keenan had proposed a timber sale of Indian Creek in 1969. And on May 17, 1969, the Mountaineering Club, led by President Bob Spur and Sharon Cisna, led a group of 53 people in a protest hike up Indian Creek, protesting the timber sale. And that was the genesis for the effort in the next year to get Chugach State Park created. And unfortunately, I left shortly after that to finish law school, so I wasn't here when all that happened. But there were 53 people on that, I think the largest hike that the Mountaineering Club ever had, that helped launch the impetus to get Chugach State Park created.
I got something to say about Neil Johannsen, and that's basically, I've been here the whole time. When he was here as a superintendent the first time, I saw him in the field. I was a soldier working at Fort Richardson. And since then, I retired in 2004, and I've been close to state parks. I'm a nut for the Eagle River Nature Center, and I've watched what happens in Chugach and the rest of the state. And Neil came along and brought us ahead. we were in a situation where we needed the leadership from outside to get us in step with the rest of the nation. Volunteerism, fees, a policy on law enforcement, a policy on how we were going to do all these things. And the team put these things together. And Neil left, other directors came in. I left, other people have taken over. But I want to tell you, Neil, what we put in place, and all these state park employees that are still around, Daryl and many others, Chris Degernes, Claire, the organization has accelerated. They get better all the time. They're doing things that we hoped people would do. They've got equipment that is better than what we had. They've got the leadership that is current for today. So the whole thing of what we did in the past built a foundation for what I'm looking at whenever I go to a state park. We did, it worked. Thanks, Neil.
More in the room. Judy.
Neil, you've had a passion for creating parks in Alaska, in Russia, in your consulting business. Where did that passion come from that really helped create the state parks as it is today?
I knew what I wanted to do since I was 10 years old. I was raised on a working ranch. I remember I got a paper route and wanted a bicycle. My father gave me a quarter horse. Said, deliver your papers on horseback. I had a very early connection with nature. I was a hunter. I did things that I wish I hadn't done. But my connection with nature just went straight into my heart. I'm a naturalist. I'm a birder. I hike. My connection with nature, and I consider all of us as nature. As I said to the commissioner this morning, you don't visit nature. You are part of nature. You know, John Boyle is part of nature. And so I just had it in the center of my heart since I was a little kid, nature. And when I got my first job driving a garbage truck for California State Parks, I loved it. I was out there scrubbing restrooms and hauling trash and stuff, but where I was is, I can't go through a day without going outside. I live in a place that gets a lot of rain and stuff, but when I moved to Bainbridge Island some years ago now, the very first thing I did when I got there, nobody knew who I was, is I drew up an open space bond on the island to buy, it was $8 million. It got tripled with grants. I got it through the Bainbridge Island City Council. I was the only person who testified, but they put it on the ballot. And it passed by 63%, and that led to $20 million worth of park acquisition on my island. Now I go hiking in these parks. And you know, Bainbridge is, you know, rich, educated. Everybody there seems to have a lot more money than me, but having these beautiful trails and parks and stuff like that, it's important. And it's also an economic engine. It's helpful. So the first thing I did was lock up 1,000 acres on Bainbridge Island.
So
Bill sure won it.
I probably don't know that. I need the milestones goes on.
We got another one out here when you're done.
What I have to say needs to go on. Well, this is great. Am I coming through? Okay. It was kind of like going on a historical tour. For me, so some of you know me. I'm a writer, and I've interviewed a lot of people in this room, and including Neil. And I have to say, so I started work at the Anchorage Times in the early '80s, and then have been writing about, and I have to say, both personally and as a writer, parks are one of my passions, and I have to say that Citizen of Dreams is, in many ways, the exact right-on phrase. I'm not sure how many Alaskans really appreciate the state park system that we have. Several of the units within the state park system are, we like to compare things, but I mean they're world-class parks, and as Neil suggested, some were considered for national park status at different times, and I guess I just want to express my appreciation to the many people in here who worked for state parks, and I know best the people connected to Chugach State Park, but also several other parks. Chugach Island and Claire, one of my favorite places, in Wood-Tikchik. I was lucky enough to get into Wood-Tikchik. And anyway, Denali, Kachemak Bay, they're all amazing places. One of the most amazing things to me is what happened with Chugach State Park. And it was, they were definitely different times. And again, as Neil alluded to, Democrats and Republicans were working together. It was an amazing thing. There was like a small window of time, I think, where it was possible to establish a park like Chugach State Park, and it happened. And it happened because of people working across the aisle, as the phrase is said. And I also, I guess, what I want to say is that Neil, I think, was a political animal in the best sense of the word. And just his stories, it shows he was able to work with people, very different perspectives. And I think, Neil, you were the right person at the right place at the right time to become the director of state parks for Alaska. So thanks to you, and many thanks to you, and also thanks to everyone else in this room who has worked on behalf of Alaska State Parks. I salute you all.
Hey, Neil.
Sandy, what the hell? You got gray.
I did.
What the hell? I got to tell a quick story about he and I were flying in a small airplane near the Yukon border years ago, and we got low on gas. And Sandy and I, with his pilot, landed on the Alaska Highway, taxied up to a gas station, filled up the airplane, and took off. And he was a newbie in Alaska, and he was like, "What the hell?" I remember that.
Well, so I'm Sandy Rabinowitz, and the reason I'm in Alaska is because Neil hired me. He left me. I was in graduate school in Oregon. He left me a phone message. It sat for a couple days because nobody ever called me, and so I called him. I had no idea in the world who he was. We started talking. About 10 minutes in, a little light went off in my head, and I said, "Are you interviewing me for a job?" And he said, "Yeah." We kept talking, and 3 weeks later, he called me back and he offered me a job. And he said, "You got to be here in 3 weeks." So I was in graduate school in Oregon. I had to be here in Alaska in 3 weeks. Well, I got on an airplane. I came. The job was 12 weeks, round-trip plane ticket. That was 1976. I am still here. I'm still here. I've had a wonderful life. I met my wife. I got 2 great kids, all kinds of wonderful things I won't bore you with, but it's because Neil hired me to come to Alaska. Something I've never forgotten. And my job was to write the second master plan for Chugach State Park. And I see faces in the room over here, Doug Fessler over there, and Pete Panarese. There may be some other, Tom Meacham I used to think was our attorney. And lots of other, other people, Judy Bittner, lots of other people. about 7 years and a couple different jobs in state parks later, I kind of got poached by the National Park Service and spent 30-plus years of my career working for the National Park Service. But I just, and apologize, I was late. I had another commitment that kept me from being here on time. But anyway, I wanted to come down and be able to say hi to Neil and appreciate this opportunity just to, again, say, hey, thanks. Like, man, you made my life in a way I could have never dreamed of.
Hi, I'm Katie Ringsmith. I'm the Alaska State Historian, and I replace Joe Antonsen, who's also here in the room, who should also be recognized as one of the core folks who are part of this larger story. Now, granted, I might be a historian, but what I'm actually interested in is what your thoughts are for the future, for state parks as we look into a rather uncertain future, but one that's coming nonetheless.
Well, at first it's kind of difficult for me because I left a long time ago. I guess I always just sort of hope for the best, you know. I consider the Alaska State Park system, as I mentioned, as part of the just sort of the trust, the public land trust. And I'm not putting down national parks, but there's a hell of a big difference between the accessibility of Chugach State Park versus Gates of the Arctic. And I've always hoped, and I lobbied the commissioner about this, that the legislature would treat the organization better. You know, there are 50 state marine park areas that we planned and published and did all this stuff. You know, sometimes the idea of a park is viewed negatively. I view it positively. It's part of it's just part of the permanent fund. And as I said, without any doubt, biggest failure was always trying to get a better operating budget. That's what I would hope for, is that they receive the kind of protective management that, and love, you know. I have an idea that I was going to lobby the commissioner about this morning, but I didn't, is I've had this sort of literally a dream down at the trailhead for the Turnagain Arm Trail, it used to be called the Johnson Trail, the Turnagain Arm Trail, that I would like to get a big glacial erratic there and carve into that stone, enjoy and protect your system of dreams. Just to make people think about all of the people who created this, they're dead and they're dying. They're going to be gone. Could we do that? It's just letters carved in a rock. You know, love and protect your system of dreams.
Any other questions? Anybody online? Comments? Anybody online?
Al Miners, are you really there?
Yeah, he is. Let me unmute him.
Yes, I am, Neil.
I still refer to you, Al, as my hired brain. That, you know, you and I work so closely together on so many things, creating parks, etc. But I used to view Al as my hired brain.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
If there's nothing else in the room and nothing else online, thank you all for coming. We'll have plenty of time to come up and chat.